a true feeling story about a garden that grew more than food. Based on real wartime memories, USA 1942. They called it a victory garden. But to me, it was just a patch of dirt behind the chicken coop. Until that summer when everything changed. It was the spring of 1942, and I had just turned 14. My older brother, Tommy, had left for basic training 2 weeks earlier, and our house had gone quiet in the way homes do when someone you love is suddenly gone. Mama tried to act like nothing was different. She still baked on Thursdays, still hummed while she swept the floor, still set 4 places at the dinner table, even though only 3 of us sat down. But I noticed she started cutting recipes in half, and that she folded Tommy's laundry even though his drawer stayed empty. One Sunday after church, Papa pointed to the backyard and said, "We're going to plant something this year." I blinked. "You mean like flowers?" He shook his head. "Vegetables. We're going to grow food." I looked at Mama. She gave a small nod, as if it wasn't a question. "The government's asking folks to grow their own," she said. "Less pressure on the supply lines. More for the boys overseas." I didn't really understand supply lines, but I knew that Mama had traded a pair of old gloves for 2 packets of seeds, beans and tomatoes, and that she held them like they were more valuable than anything in the pantry. We started clearing the patch that afternoon. It was hard, stubborn work. The soil was dry in some places, too wet in others. There were rocks the size of potatoes, tangled roots, and old rusted nails that had no business being there. But we worked anyway. Papa dug. I raked. Mama knelt in the dirt with her apron tucked up and her jaw set like stone. By the time the sun went down, we had a space the size of our living room carved into the earth. It didn't look like much, but to us it was something. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing my brother in some distant camp, eating from a tin tray, wondering if he knew we were planting for him. For all of them. I got up quietly and walked to the window. The backyard was still, the moonlight brushing over the garden like a promise. And I whispered, "Grow." The next few weeks became a rhythm. School, garden, supper, sleep, repeat. I learned how to read the soil with my hands, how to water without drowning, how to pinch back leaves that grew too wild. The neighbors started noticing. Old Mrs. Langley brought over a bundle of carrot seeds in a wax paper envelope. Mr. Green loaned us his rusted wheelbarrow and a jar of saved rainwater. Even little Danny from next door helped pull weeds, though he mostly just got in the way. But that was the thing. People wanted to help. In a world that felt upside down, a patch of dirt became something we could stand on. Then came the frost. Late May. A cold snap out of nowhere. We woke up to find half the leaves wilted, drooped like mourning flags. Mama stared out the window and said nothing. Papa quietly boiled water, took it outside, and poured it around the base of the tomato plants, as if warmth could still save them. I sat on the back step and tried not to cry. But they didn't all die. Some came back, slowly, stubbornly, pushing through the wilt like they'd heard us praying. By June, we had green again, and something inside me had started growing too. It wasn't just a garden anymore. It was something alive, something we were all part of, something that felt like hope. A true feeling wartime story about what we choose to grow. That summer taught me more than all my years of school combined. Not from books, but from dirt. From the way a tomato vine twists towards sunlight, and the way people do, too. After the frost, something changed in our house. Not loudly, not all at once, but like how the smell of rain lingers even after the clouds are gone. We started measuring time differently. Not by months or holidays, but by sprouts, leaves, and what survived the night. Papa kept a garden journal. Not a fancy one, just a notebook from the 5 and dime store. He recorded what we planted, what took, what didn't. Mama hung a string across the kitchen window and clipped seed packets to it like photos of old friends. And I started talking to the plants. Not loud, not silly, just soft words while I watered them. Sometimes I'd tell them about Tommy, where I imagined he was, what I hoped he was eating. Sometimes I'd tell them about my day at school. Sometimes I'd just ask them to keep growing. And maybe they heard me, because grow they did. By July, our garden was green and stubborn and full of life. The beans had reached up past my knees. The tomatoes had flowered. And the carrots, though still shy, had started poking orange from the dirt like they were testing the air. Neighbors came more often. Some brought seeds. Some brought scraps for compost. Some just stood quietly, staring at the rows, like they were remembering something they'd forgotten. One afternoon, Mr. Jennings from 3 houses down stopped by. He was usually a quiet man. Former teacher, I think. But that day he carried a small wooden box. Inside were envelopes. Old, weathered, some nearly falling apart. He handed them to Mama and said, "Saved these from my grandfather's garden. Civil War era, most of them. Don't know what'll come up, if anything, but figured it's better they end up here than in a drawer." Mama smiled and said softly, "Even old seeds can surprise you." The town began changing, too. The church put up a bulletin board labeled, "From our gardens to the boys." People pinned photos of their victory gardens, notes to their sons, and handwritten prayers. The school let kids plant in the far field. Miss Delaney, our teacher, taught math using rows of beans instead of chalkboards. She said, "Growing something teaches you patience, and math, and hope." And the grocer started accepting jars of homegrown vegetables for store credit. Even one tomato could count toward a loaf of bread. But not everything grew. One week in August, the cucumbers yellowed. Papa said it was the heat. Mama said it was the soil. I thought maybe it was just bad luck. I stood out there one evening, staring at the shriveled vines, hands in fists, and I whispered, "We did everything right." The plants didn't answer, but the beans were still climbing. So I went and picked 5, gave 3 to Mama, left 1 on Mr. Jennings' porch, and ate the last one raw. Right there, juice on my chin, dirt on my knees, tasted like something earned. We started sending boxes. Not big ones, just brown paper packages with what we could spare. Dried beans, pickled carrots, letters, poems, hand-stitched handkerchiefs, and once, a single cherry tomato wrapped in a cotton napkin with a note that said, "It grew with love. Hope it reaches you the same way." One evening, we received a letter from Tommy, the first in over a month. He didn't say where he was, just that it was hot and loud and never stops moving. But he said, "Tell Papa I remember how to weed rows by feel. I close my eyes sometimes and pretend I'm back in the garden, next to the coop, with sun on my back and your voice in the air." I read that line 3 times. Then I folded the letter, put it in my pocket, and went outside. The sun was setting. The beans cast long shadows, and the dirt was still warm. I knelt beside the rows and whispered, "He remembers you." And for a second, I swore I saw one of the plants nod. By early September, the garden had become part of us. We didn't talk about it like a project anymore. It was a room in our house, a place we carried around on the soles of our shoes and under our fingernails. Tomatoes ripened faster than we could pick them. The beans nearly swallowed the back fence. And the carrots were so sweet we stopped adding sugar to anything else. But it wasn't just about food anymore. It was about something to hold on to. I started spending more time out there alone. Just me and the sounds. Cicadas in the tall grass, the creak of the old wheelbarrow, Papa's quiet cough from the porch. Some nights I'd lay between the rows and look up at the stars. wondering if Tommy could see the same sky, wondering if he was safe, if he'd eat what we sent, if he'd come home with dirt still under his nails, or if that part of him was gone now. In mid-September, we held what Mama called the Neighborhood Harvest Exchange. It wasn't official. No flyers, no committee, just a row of tables in front of the church, a patchwork of boxes, jars, and smiling eyes. Some brought more than they took. Some brought nothing and left full. We gave away 6 jars of pickled carrots, 2 baskets of tomatoes, and a bundle of dried beans wrapped in last year's Christmas paper. And someone left us a single butternut squash with a note. First time it grew in my yard. I think it liked the company. Papa read that note twice and smiled in that quiet way of his, like he'd heard a prayer answered. Then, in October, the letter came. It was thinner than the others. No extra sheet. No jokes in the margins. Tommy had been injured, nothing fatal, but enough to slow him down for a while. As he wrote, Mama sat at the table a long time after reading it. Didn't cry, didn't speak, just held the letter like it might vanish if she let go. That night, I picked one perfect tomato, still warm from the sun, cut it in half, sprinkled salt, and we shared it in silence. Half for him, half for home. The days got shorter, the leaves turned, and the soil cooled. We pulled up the last of the beans in the first week of November. Papa bundled the stalks and set them to dry in the shed. I asked if we were done. For now, he said, but not forever. Mama began sewing again. Not just handkerchiefs, but quilts made from Tommy's old shirts. Each square told a different story. The plaid one he wore to the fair. The green one he hated but wore anyway on church days. The striped one with a torn sleeve from that time he fell off the chicken coop. She didn't call it a quilt. She called it a promise. He'll need something warm when he comes home. December arrived with frost and letters. Tommy said he could walk again. Slowly but proudly. Said he missed the taste of tomatoes. Said he dreamed of dirt under his nails. Christmas came quiet that year. No big tree. No piles of presents. Just 3 candles, a warm fire, and a tin box filled with seeds for next spring. One by one, we read the names written on the packets. Clemson spineless okra, heirloom cherry tomato, blue lake pole bean, resilience radish. That one made Papa laugh. Each name sounded like something sacred. And then, on New Year's Eve, as we finished dinner and I reached for my coat to check the garden one last time before the snow, we heard a knock at the door. A slow, steady knock. The kind you don't forget. Papa opened it. And there stood Tommy. Thinner, quieter, but standing. Mama gasped. I froze. Papa said nothing. Just stepped forward and wrapped him in a hug so still, it felt like the world paused to watch. That night, we sat by the fire. No one wanted to sleep. Tommy reached into his coat and pulled out a small linen pouch. I brought something back, he said. He poured a handful of foreign seeds onto the table. From a French farmer. He said they're strong. Survive anything. Said they tasted like hope. We planted them in the spring. And they grew. Not tall. Not fast. But they grew. Years later, when the war was just a memory and I had a family of my own, I'd walk through my own garden barefoot, feeling the dirt underfoot and the echo of my father's voice. Grow something, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. Because sometimes what we plant has nothing to do with food and everything to do with faith. Seedling, that was the year we planted more than vegetables. Seedling, that was the year we planted hope. Ellie Boone, 1942 to 1943. During World War II, while millions of soldiers were fighting overseas, another kind of battle was taking place. right in the backyards, vacant lots, and rooftops of American homes. This battle wasn't fought with weapons. It was fought with shovels, seeds, and soil. They called them victory gardens. By 1942, the U.S. government had realized that food supplies were being stretched dangerously thin. Commercial crops were being redirected to feed troops abroad and allies overseas. Transportation was prioritized for military use. And many food items like sugar, meat, butter, and canned goods became rationed. To ease the pressure, Americans were asked to grow their own food. It wasn't just a suggestion. It became a nationwide movement. Patriotic duty. Posters, radio announcements, and magazine ads encouraged families to sow the seeds of victory. And Americans responded. They planted in their backyards, on rooftops, in schoolyards, factory courtyards, and even in window boxes. In cities like Chicago and Los Angeles, entire parks were turned into growing fields. In rural towns, neighbors shared seeds, tools, and tips. Even First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt planted a victory garden on the White House lawn. A bold move, considering the government had discouraged it during World War I. By the peak of the movement, over 20 million victory gardens had been planted across the United States. And they weren't small. Together, they produced nearly 40% of all fresh vegetables consumed in the country during the war years. Tomatoes, beans, carrots, lettuce, cucumbers, peas, squash, corn. Even families who had never gardened before were suddenly growing food, learning to compost, preserve, and share. But victory gardens weren't just about food. They gave people purpose in uncertain times. They gave children something to care for, and parents a way to feel they were still protecting their families. They strengthened communities, restored hope, and reminded Americans that even in darkness, things could grow. In many ways, victory gardens became symbols of quiet resilience. Proof that courage isn't always found on the battlefield. Sometimes it grows in rows. After the war ended, many of these gardens faded. Fields were paved, tools stored away. Life moved on. But their legacy lives in memory, in photos, and in stories like the one you just heard. So the next time you see a sprout pushing through the soil, or pass by a backyard full of tomatoes in July, remember this. It's not just about what we grow. It's about why we grow it. And sometimes, a handful of beans and a patch of earth can carry the weight of an entire nation.